Phew, safe and sound. Hello everybody and welcome to Season 6 of Chatsunami. I'm currently here at the Spencer Podcast Mansion, investigating some strange going-ons. I was told about a suspicious group of people called the Brolly Corporation, who seem to be using bots to make some AI-generated podcasts. Now from what I've heard, their aim is supposedly to phase out our indie podcasts with theirs. Not if I have anything to say about it. I was actually supposed to meet here with the rest of the Chatsunami team, but it looks like I'm going in solo for this mission. But seeing as it's just you and me here, Pandalorians, I guess we might as well chat for a while. Or at least I'll chat and you put the kettle on. For long-time listeners of the show, you'll know that my relationship with horror games is rather tentative. Did I actually solve a puzzle? Growing up, one of my core scarring memories of childhood was playing the first Harry Potter game and being absolutely terrified by the trolls you had to sneak around in the dungeon. Some may call that a scaredy cat, but I call it tactically on my toes, preferably to the exit of course. But it wasn't until I got older that I found a somewhat love-hate relationship with the world of horror games. If anything, I think my fear of the unknown is something that all of us are wary of in some way or another. That innate instinct to warn us of any upcoming dangers that may loom in the shadows. Of course, that's not to say I was totally ignorant of what was popular in the genre. Honestly, I think that may have been due to the gaming news of the time hyping up today's topic so much, and the unfortunate adaptations that followed. And as you've probably read by the title, I neither have the console nor the bravery to go toe-to-toe with Pyramid Head and Silent Hill, so yeah, we are taking a right on that Horror Road junction into quite possibly one of the most iconic franchises gaming has ever produced. Resident Evil. Created by Capcom in 1996 and directed by Shinji Mikami, the origins of the game threw me off guard. As a child of the 90s and early 2000s, I vividly remember the box art of this game. It was of a man with a crooked face, swarmed by massive spiders and shadows looming over him. At first glance, it hardly screamed survival horror, but with zombies. But I still remember it was one my brother used to play. Of course, my parents were strict in what I could and couldn't play due to my age, rightfully so of course, so I didn't really experience much of the game at the time. Funny enough though, I still have the original PlayStation case and game for Resident Evil, a memento of course to that time. But the origins of Resident Evil, or Biohazard as it's known in Japan, stems from, of all things, a horror RPG in 1989 for the Famicom, known as Sweet Home. Now stop me if you've heard this one. A group of 5 individuals go into a haunted mansion in search of a particular item, and along the way they battle supernatural entities in a bid to survive. And if you just said Scooby-Doo out loud, I have some questions. Jokes aside, while Sweet Home is not a prequel to the Resident Evil series, nor does it share much in common beyond the mansion setting, it's interesting to see how the developers' desire to make something similar influenced what it would eventually become. It's also interesting to see how other works of art influence the identity of the franchise. From the pre-rendered backdrops being inspired by the Overlook Hotel of The Shining, to a shift towards more Americanized horror with the adoption of the zombie angle, rather than a heavy lean into the psychological horror. But one influence that blew me completely away was that of 1992's Alone in the Dark, one which Mikami is credited as the reason we have fixed camera angles in the series. Without it, the game is reported to have been planned as a first-person shooter when it moved from being developed as a Super NES game to the PlayStation. It's a bit of a shame because nowadays I think that Alone in the Dark is now irrevocably tethered to that awful Uwe Boll adaptation. What's also fascinating to note is, bar the spin-offs such as Survivor and the Umbrella Chronicles, it wouldn't be until 2017 where we would get our first mainline game set entirely in first person for Resident Evil Biohazard, or I guess Biohazard Squared in Japan. But without this seemingly minor change, the whole series may have been remembered differently. Even as someone who didn't play the games at the time, I knew exactly what they looked like, if that makes sense. It wasn't wasn't just a case of equating a zombie game as a Resident Evil clone, but instead the aesthetic, which I'm sure would also be burned into the minds of all the children way too young to play this in 1996. Released on March 22nd, 1996, the game itself was a sweeping success. Selling over 4 million copies by December 1997, the game had a number of re-releases for other consoles such as the Sega Saturn, Windows, and even a cancelled Game Boy port, which is honestly wild to me. Not only did it become a titan of gaming, but it did wonders popularising the survival horror genre, as well as zombies in general. That being said, while the game was mind-blowing at the time, I can't deny that there's a few things that may not have held up as well. From the graphics to the slightly cheesy dialogue, it's a little jarring looking back on it out of context. Although what I will say is, it gave me one of my all-time favourite interactions.
Is this?
That's right. This is the ultimate life form. Tyrant! Chris? Stop it.
Wesker, you're pitiful.
Personally, I think I should start doing that to people I disagree with, but I digress. It wasn't until 2002, however, that Nintendo fans would get to eat well with the Resident Evil content, as an exclusivity deal between Nintendo and Capcom was agreed on. This saw them produce several games for the GameCube between 2002 and 2005, with the prequel game Resident Evil 0, fan favourite Resident Evil 4, and of course today's topic, Resident Evil Remake. And I have to say, the development of this game is just as, if not more interesting than the original entry, and while the crooked face of the previous protagonist of the cover art was struck off for something new, it was replaced by the second protagonist fighting for a life against a zombie. While this undeniably now screams that it's a zombie game, it does seem like a bit of an overcompensation. There seems to have been a massive back and forth between the developers as to what they were trying to achieve. Initially it would have just been updated graphics, but the more Mikami and his team discussed this, the more the development seemed to drift towards balancing between a fresh experience without sacrificing what made Resident Evil so good in the first place. And if I'm being honest, I think this is probably the one that made me realise just how special the franchise truly was. If you've listened to our past Chatsu Cafe episode, you'll have no doubt heard my co-host Martin McAllister mock my play order for this series, so I'm going to lay my cards on the table here. If it wasn't for the masterpiece that is Resident Evil 4 Remake, then I may not have gotten sucked into the world of survival horror, which has admittedly evolved over the years. And while the remakes did indeed get further remasters in 2015 to include a number of optional goodies and was polished for next-gen consoles, it was this version that truly allowed me to appreciate not only its humble origins, but how such a game could somehow outclass its successors in ways I never thought possible. Ultimately though, my main focus this month has been playing the remakes of 1 through to 4, as well as Resident Evil 5 to 8. It's been an experience that's been riddled with much apprehension, confusion, and more jump scares than I can shake a stick at, but for better or worse, each game in the series has something memorable about it, that one seed planted in my mind to remind me why this series is still beloved, even today. But why did the RE1 remake leave such an impression on me after playing through the rest of the series? Is it the perfect starting point for new fans? And is it even possible for this game to retain relevance 23 years on from its original release? Or, I guess I should say re-release. Without any further ado, grab your green herbs and berets as we dive into the world of Resident Evil Remake. Welcome to Resident Evil Month. Welcome to Chatsunami, a Scottish variety podcast that discusses topics from gaming and films to anime and general interests. Join me, your host, Satsunami, as well as the rest of our Chatsunami team for our takes on these very important pop culture topics.
Sir, it's clearly a trap. I accept your bait!
That happens 3 times in the film. Like every time that general goes, don't do this one thing, he goes, do you know what I'm gonna do? That's the exact
It does as well. She had the pointy teeth. What was that about?
She looked like Bilbo when he wants the ring back.
She did, didn't she? I just want the lightsaber one more time.
Parasite says, "No, you will get back into your office and work."
No, says the man in Zoom. Trousers are for the working man.
You're bursting into your hotel room. Honey, we need to go.
Leave the kids. You can milk an audition. Oh!
That's the worst thing you've ever said in any of the episodes.
If that sounds like your cup of tea, then you can check us out at our website, chatsunami.com, as well as all good podcast apps. As always, stay safe, stay awesome, and most importantly, stay hydrated.
Stay classy and have a banana. This has been Satsunami.
I'm sorry. So let's start with the core question. What in the heck is Resident Evil actually about? Set in 1998, the game kicks off with several reports of grisly murders happening outside of Raccoon City. Unfortunately, since true crime podcasts didn't exist back then, it's up to the Raccoon City Police Department, who waste no time in sending their best teams to the scene, known as the iconic Special Tactics and Rescue Service. I think they had another name, mind you. Alright, of course, thank you. As I was, what the fuck? After losing contact with a Bravo team, it's up to the Alpha team to come to the rescue. Unfortunately, things don't go to plan, and after a rather aggressive set of Dobermans who got rejected by Crufts split up the group, they're forced to seek refuge in the now infamous Spencer Mansion. I don't have to explain much for those who have already played the game, but for those who haven't, oof, the atmosphere hits you like a ton of bricks right away. Beyond a few key moments, the majority of the sound design leaves the atmospheric noises to do the heavy lifting, and I have to say, this is probably one of my favourite sound design choices throughout the entire mainline series so far. It is extremely immersive and really puts you into the boots of your STARS member of choice, stomping around in trepidation around every corner, not knowing what to expect. It forces you to be alone with your thoughts, manifesting them into a cluster of fear and doubt, as whenever you open a door, an animation plays followed by a plunge into darkness. While admittedly these door animations outstay their welcome on repeated backtracking and replays, it's still an effective way to build tension. What I was also surprised to enjoy as well was the fixed camera angles. As I said, when preparing for this month, playing the remakes and later entries usually gave you the freedom to move the camera however you liked, minus the ones in first person of course. And as much as these were unsettling in their own ways, it doesn't compare to how this game forces you to play. Initially, I was unsure about it, as if you've gone the Benjamin Button style like I did and played the series backwards, then it can be hard to adapt initially. But once you get used to it, you can see how well it fits into the game, and thereby adds a further layer of tension. You almost feel like a voyeur at times as your character of choice makes their way through the mansion, making the player watch helplessly, just out of reach and unable to see what's around the corner. The game dictates what you can and cannot see, robbing you of not only a degree of control, but also your sanity. In the dining room you hear the droning of a grandfather clock and the clap of thunder echo repeatedly, something that initially got on my nerves, but it's that very thing that sets you on edge as you try to concentrate. The game knows it has you in its stranglehold, and it won't be long until it unleashes the horrors of the mansion on you at a moment's notice. Before we go on, however, and discuss the gameplay further, I should first address the characters that you play as. In this game, you have the choice of choosing between Resident Badass Jill Valentine or pre-Swole Days Chris Redfield to navigate the Spencer Mansion. Both have their own pros and cons, with Jill being considered as the more easy option due to holding 2 more inventory slots than Chris. However, this is traded off for Chris being able to tank more hits, and each playthrough will have you working with different characters. For Jill, you team up occasionally with family man Barry Burton, Well, Chris eventually teams up with Bravo team prodigy Rebecca Chambers, but no matter who you team up with, you will also be overshadowed by your superior and Resident Evil sexy man of the franchise, Albert Wesker, who... Wait a minute, who wrote that in the script? And why is there seductive jazz music playing?
Oi, stop that.
As I was saying, you will encounter different characters, which in turn will always give you a fresh experience every time. Personally, I'm on Team Jill when I play through this game, not only due to the easier difficulty, but just how cool of a character she is throughout. It's actually something I notice when playing through as both Chris and Jill, is that they act relatively realistic for the most part. This isn't the same duo who are world-weary and tired of seeing BOWs on a daily basis, but instead out of their depth for the horrors that they're forced to confront. In turn, this means that you as the player feels that same fear by proxy, whether it's being chased by zombies, dogs, or, let's face it, other abominations. This puts the emphasis on the survival part of survival horror, as you need to manage your resources via a limited set of active slots. It's a somewhat irony, as you in theory are meant to be the best of the best in your field, and by all means should be prepared for most quote-unquote normal extreme circumstances, but when even the experts are put into a game of life and death, you realise that you must constantly be vigilant at all times. The remake brought a lot more to the table beyond its graphical update. Gameplay-wise, we got a more modern feeling control scheme, as well as an expanded area to explore, making the game feel less like a one-to-one interpretation of the old one, and more of them adding what they couldn't previously. One feature I must admit I'm really grateful for is the ability to counter zombies with defensive weapons should they grab me. This ranges from stun guns to defensive daggers, and if you're in your Gordon Ramsay era, you can feed any attacker with a flashbang souffle. One other thing I want to briefly touch on is the save mechanic. Throughout the game you'll find ink ribbons and typewriters, which serve as the game's save function. This means that not only will you have to temporarily sacrifice an item slot to carry them into the next save room, but you'll also need an ink ribbon to save your game. Save rooms in Resident Evil serve as a refuge where nothing can harm you, and in addition have some of the best soundtracks. I have some mixed opinions on this save system in hindsight, although it's not a deal breaker. The main reason that they've implemented this is to intensify the survival horror aspect. After all, do you risk trying to make your way through the mansion without saving, or do you use up all your ink ribbons at the beginning and then leave yourself wide open to danger later on? It's a personal pet peeve of mine, but I'm not a huge fan of games that judge their difficulty by not allowing the player to save, and then forcing them to go back to the last save that was several hours ago, thereby wasting their time by having to replay a large section of the game. But when I played this, I found myself with more than enough ink ribbons to save, and by carefully managing my time and resources, I never found it a big issue. But if you've come directly from the newer remakes, then playing this, and by extension Resident Evil 0, will definitely be a minor surprise. But beyond even that, they use certain changes masterfully to their advantage to up the horror of the game. One thing I never realised was absent from the original game was the terrifying Crimson Heads. During your time in the mansion, you will encounter a number of zombies that you must choose whether or not to engage with to save ammo. If you're lucky enough, you'll be able to blow their heads off and that'll put an end to the matter. Sadly, if you somehow missed the memo about destroying the brains or setting the bodies on fire, then you'll be greeted later on by an even more aggressive variant of the typical zombie. Aptly named after the red heads, the Crimson Heads shriek at you as they come charging towards you, a far cry from the slow and lumbering zombies of before. The first time I stepped through that door and came face to face with one, I nearly dropped my Steam Deck out of fear, but despite the damage to my ever fragile sanity, I believe it was a wonderful addition to the game. There is one other character that I want to briefly touch on, and it could quite possibly be one of the most tragic stories within the RE universe. While we know it well as the Spencer Mansion, the true architect's story is one of heartbreak and tragedy. After being commissioned by Oswald Spencer to build the mansion with a set of elaborate traps and puzzles, some might I add better than others, George Trevor was invited to celebrate the completion of the mansion in 1967. While his work kept him delayed from arriving that evening, his wife Jessica and daughter Lisa decided to go on ahead. It was here that they were kidnapped and brutally experimented on with strains of the progenitor virus that would eventually be the basis for later iterations, such as the T-virus, aka the one that you only take if you want to become a zombie. And by the time George arrived to the mansion, he was unaware that his own wife and daughter had been tortured by the makings of what would eventually become the Umbrella Corporation. While George would eventually starve to death trying to escape, and his wife executed because of her incompatibility with the virus, their daughter Lisa, known to only a few researchers, would remain there to be broken and experimented on further. While I've never rooted for the Umbrella Corporation before, this is the perfect example of how they seek to achieve their callous goals, all at the expense of a child's life. Lisa would eventually be presumed dead after being executed, but her regenerative abilities kept her alive and essentially cursed her to wander the Arklay Mountains, claiming a cabin used for storage as her home. From a gameplay perspective, you can hear her wails echo from the basement, and eventually when you're ambushed in her cabin, you get to come face to face with her. It was something that caught me off guard initially, and I never really knew what I was looking at. She was a hunched over mutated human with her wrists bound in wooden stocks and metal cuffs around her ankles with the chain in between broken. To new players, she may very well just be like any other variant of zombie, only this time unkillable. What threw me off was the noises she made, the clanking of chains and the low guttural moans of pain. Lisa is not fast by any means, but much like later iterations of stalking enemies in the series, she takes her time. Unless you read the files scattered around the mansion, Lisa's identity has been erased entirely, and it is sickening once you know who you're up against. Unfortunately, you're also forced to dispatch of her later on in the game, and while that ultimately does not kill her, it isn't a victory I found myself celebrating. The developers could have easily omitted this from the remake, and it still would have been a stellar experience. However, this addition did wonders to the game and solidified just how horrifying the world of Resident Evil truly could be. These weren't your run-of-the-mill zombies who wanted an entree of brains. They were real human beings, ones with hopes and feelings that would be snuffed out thanks to the greed of a corporation. Admittedly, the whole game isn't without its flaws. While it can comfortably stand knowing that it's an example of how to do a remake right, I have my minor nitpicks which may be heresy to veteran Resident Evil fans. As I said before, while the opening door animations built tension to begin with, they became severely repetitive when you had to backtrack. I think the best trade-off would have been to have either had an option to turn them off, or at the very least only kept them on for the first time you went through them. Another minor thing was the puzzles themselves throughout the mansion. I must admit, there were a lot of them that I felt a sense of accomplishment working out when I finally had that aha moment after finding something along the way that would help. But with that being said, there were a few that left me going, after I had to look up how to solve them. That's not to mention the error I made when I put one of the metal medallions into the door for the basement, only to realise that I had to run back for that same medallion because it opened a door on the other side of the mansion which would allow me to retrieve the second medallion. Again, I wouldn't call any of these bad per se, or even dare say that they're not needed. After all, puzzle solving in RE games is a core part of the series, but I'm sure all Resident Evil fans can agree that there's always that one dud. In relation to the puzzles, one that was particularly annoying was the one where you had to put a statue into the wall before the walls at either side closed in on you. The only issue that I had with this one was that the changing fixed angles were a challenge in navigating this room in order to make it on time. And while others have simply said, just change to the tank controls, I don't think it's a ringing endorsement to demand players to change control schemes just for one puzzle. That being said, it's a minor blip in an otherwise flawless game. As for the progression of the game itself, I'd be lying if I didn't say it didn't get a little fantastical by the end, which would eventually become a trope for the whole series. Initially, you have your standard lumbering zombies and infected dogs, which I must admit I died more times than I care to admit. But by the end you were fighting things like giant spiders, killer plants, lizard creatures called hunters, and last but certainly not least, a big giant snake. Yes, I know it's called the Yawn, but that it reminds me of that old advice. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. In short, Umbrella shouldn't have been grabbing everything in sight to experiment on. Not everything needs a BOW. This culminates in you being told that one of your teammates is a mole in your ranks. Not a literal BOW mole, although that would be hilarious. As you finally delve into the bowels of the mansion, you come across what is now a staple of the series, laboratory under where you've been the entire time. Look, if there isn't an abandoned laboratory overrun with undead horrors, then are you really part of Umbrella? Of course, if you've seen a sliver of any of the other games, then you'll know that the one who betrayed you is none other than the captain of your team, Albert Wesker, who... Stop that! As I was saying, he reveals that he's been working with Umbrella the whole time and is about to unleash one of their greatest creations, the Tyrant. Which, yeah, don't hate me for this one, but it's definitely one of the weaker Tyrant designs. Now don't get me wrong, I know why the Tyrant is designed this way, because it was the first one of the series and no doubt they didn't want to go too crazy, but at the end of the day it's just a tall, naked man with a claw for a hand. Again, I'm sure that if this was your first game, then seeing this thing would have been terrifying, but after fighting against other tyrant zombies such as Mr. X and Nemesis, this one didn't have the same impact. So really it's more of a me issue rather than a critique of the game, but I guess you could say that this tyrant walked so that Mr. X and Nemesis could run, or stomp angrily and give me nightmares. It's a strange thing to say, but I feel as if this remake stands out because of how distinctive it is compared to the remakes that came after it. While there were supposedly plans to make Resident Evil 2 Remake more akin to the first in terms of fixed camera angles, the later remakes, and by extension the other games, adopt a more modern gaming approach to the controls. And while personally I do feel that in some ways that is a good thing to make the series more accessible, it loses a little bit of what makes Resident Evil what it is. Resident Evil isn't the first series to encounter this issue, nor will it be the last. For a series to survive, it must adapt to some degree, for better or for worse, with the gaming landscape. After all, that's why we have the fantastic Resident Evil 4 and the not so fantastic Resident Evil 6. Ever since the fourth game, the series moved towards a more action-oriented style, so it became more action horror rather than survival horror, which then leads me to conclude with one final question. What is Resident Evil? I don't mean literally, of course, because we've been talking about it this entire time, but instead in the sense of what makes Resident Evil so distinctive and beloved among its fans. Is it because of the legacy characters? The gameplay? Or is there more to the makeup of this series as a whole? Honestly, I think this question itself deserves an entire episode to discuss, but let's look at how the first Resident Evil remake tackles this question. Unlike the remakes that came afterwards, the game blends modernity with classic gaming so seamlessly, from the controls to an environment dripping in atmosphere. This isn't just a game, it's an experience. It's something that beckons you like a siren's call into the darkness. You want to look away but you can't, entranced by the macabre beauty of it all. And the best part of it is that it is thoroughly accessible for new fans of the series wanting to get into it. Granted, as I've said, I've got my nitpicks of the game. Not all of it is sunshine and tyrants, as some elements are a little outdated, but at the same time not too outdated to stop you having fun. Playing this series in reverse order may be jarring at first, but it forces you to take things at a steady pace. There's no running or gunning here as you stand your ground, aiming at your stumbling target whose only thought is to devour you. And after all the hardships, game overs and shooting giant sharks in the face, trust me, made sense in context, I can safely say that I fell in love with this game. Watching Jill rest her head on Chris's shoulders during their narrow helicopter escape as the Spencer mansion blew up in the background left a smile on my face. At last, I had completed Resident Evil. Horror aficionados out there may not realise how big of a deal this is to me, but when I was younger, games like this terrified me away from even trying them. Even for this month, it took me ages just to pluck up the courage to play Resident Evil 2 Remake because of the prospect of Mr. X, or even the Baker family in Biohazard, but these games gave me the confidence to face my fears in a world rich with wonderful characters. And while the characterisation may have changed since their debut game, that conversation will need to wait until another day. Resident Evil Remake is a masterclass in how to craft not only the perfect horror experience, but also bridge the gap between classic and modern gaming. If you haven't already played this game yet and are on the fence, then I would wholeheartedly recommend it. While it might not be everybody's cup of tea, newcomers into the genre are completely missing out on an otherwise suspenseful experience. But for the veterans and newcomers of the series, what did you think of Resident Evil 1's remake? Was it the horror experience you always dreamed of? Or should it have been locked away forever in the depths of the Spencer Mansion's basement? Please reach out to us and let us know, because I would love to hear from you. But as always, thank you all so much for listening to this first episode of Resident Evil Month. Next week we'll be joined by the one and only Luke from the Howdy Beans podcast to discuss the hit Resident Evil 2 remake and the contentious sequel Resident Evil 3 remake. Be sure not to miss it. If you would like to listen to more episodes from ourselves, then you can check us out on our website chatsunami.com, as well as all good podcast apps. A huge shout out to our wonderful Pandalorian patrons Robotic Battle Toaster, Ghostie and Cryptic1991. Thank you all so much for the support. And if you would like early access to our episodes, commentary tracks, as well as a whole bunch of exclusive goodies, then you can support us over on patreon.com/Chatsunami. This podcast is of course a proud member of the PodPack Collective. For further information, check us out on our Twitter/X page, PodPack Collect. But until next time, thank you all so much for listening, because we have a fantastic month planned. As always, stay safe, stay awesome, and most importantly, wait a minute, did I leave the kettle on? Oh, dang it! Stay hydrated, everyone.